So, hey folks, welcome. This is Mana from My Purpose Academy, and this is Dr. Christian Busch. I am quite excited, honestly, because I have been lucky to somehow get in touch with you via Twitter. I have been listening to your book and now finally got a hard copy of it. Serendipity Mindset, and it struck me like lightning. So I'm very, very excited to have you here today. You are in New York. Tonight, I am in Cologne. So thanks, Zoom. Christian, maybe you can say a few words to about yourself. You are a renowned scholar. I will put the links where people can look up your bio, but maybe there is something you don't put online that you would like to share about yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, Manan. It's great to be here. And yeah, no, I used to be that kid. I grew up in Heidelberg in Germany, and I was kicked out of high school, had to repeat a year, and transferred this into my driving style. And I probably held the unofficial world record of how many dustbins you can knock over on your way to school when you're driving. But then one day I wasn't so lucky anymore and crashed into 4 parked cars, and all cars completely destroyed, including my own. And I won't forget the policeman who came to the scene, and he was like, "Oh my God, he's still alive." And that idea that I was supposed to be dead, that stuck with me. And I asked myself all these strange questions, if I would have died, who would have come to my funeral? Who would have actually cared? Was it all worth it? And at that point, I only had depressing answers. And so I started reading this amazing book, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is highly recommended. This idea of how do you find meaning in crisis. And what I realized is what I find meaning in is connecting ideas, connecting people, and seeing how dots connect. And so, I started out as community builder, entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, and later academia. And, a lot of what we'll talk about today, I think, is that the most inspiring, joyful, purposeful people around me seem to have something in common, which is that they intuitively cultivate serendipity. And that's why I got so excited about this, to see, hey, what's the science-based framework behind this? Is there some kind of pattern that we can understand, that we can learn from, and then apply that in our own lives? And so that's really kind of the journey at the moment that I'm on, trying to, find meaning in getting the serendipity mindset into places around the world.
How old were you when you had the accident?
18-ish.
Okay, and you said that after the accident, you had like quite depressing answers about your life. I mean, of course, not everyone who's 18 thinks that much about, the course of their life, meaning of their lives, and on all this sort of heavy stuff. But I've got the sense somehow that maybe Gen Zs, as you can see right now, can relate a lot to that. How was it for you to? I mean, these are all counterfactual questions, right? Like, what would have happened if? How did you manage to revert the energy? Like from almost depressing to, hey, now I've got fuel.
I love that question also because I had something similar last year actually, where I had a severe form of COVID, and I was stuck in my New York apartment, 911 on speed dial. It was that kind of time where in New York, in Central Park, they had hospital tents because the hospitals were full. And I would call the emergency room and say, "Hey, should I come in?" And they would be like, "Well, if you're not 100% sure it's COVID, don't come in, because if it's not COVID, it'll kill you here." And so it was like a weird, strange period. And I succinctly remember how strange it felt to be alone in the apartment. And what I realized during that period was, wow, like I had focused so much on passion, purpose, and impact, that I had completely neglected building like a deep love relationship with someone. And I had completely closed myself to that kind of world. And so I think to me in that moment, similar to back in the days, it's that kind of reframing moment where you're like, wow, wake up moment. Hey, like this is something that I should focus on. And, a couple of weeks later, an old friend reconnected. She's now my wife, and we have a beautiful baby girl on the way. And
wow.
and so similar in the sense of, there was this inflection point where I was like, wow, something has to change. And I've always been a big fan of this idea that if like you can either have an event define you, or you can try to define the event. And it's very hard to do that in the moment, right? Emotionally, last year and after that accident, you feel like you're kind of like in Treibsand, right? Like in kind of like in free flow, and you're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, what's the anchor here? And that's why I find this Viktor Frankl book so fascinating, because Viktor Frankl, what he said essentially is, look, in some situations, there's no inherent meaning, right? There's no inherent meaning in losing someone you love. There's no inherent meaning in his case, he was in the concentration camp, and like he was sure to die, right? Like he was, there's no worse situation in the world, right, than being in a concentration camp. And what he did, for example, was to say, when I wake up tomorrow, I will still talk with someone else and make them feel better. And by doing this, now I have a meaning to wake up tomorrow morning. And so in a situation where there's objectively no meaning, he created a meaning. And I've always been fascinated by this idea of, hey, is there something in this moment, so even if it's small, that's still somehow meaningful? And then can I orient myself around this versus around all the other things that feel so terrible in the moment? And that then actually over time, right, it's like this whole idea of, if you want a happy ending, don't stop the story too early. And I think that's really kind of the spiel of it.
I'm just writing down a question I have to ask you, but it's somehow encouraging also, like to listen to you and see, okay, you are the serendipity guru, let's say, like the expert, you've studied it, you're evangelizing it, and still you are also struck by like severe COVID. But again, it's, this underlines like the mindset thing, like the proactive part, like you have to take ownership, control over it. Before we jump into serendipity, what it is, how you define it, and how we can cultivate it, you talked about like meaning, like Viktor Frankl said, you have to find someone to make him or her happy. Is it right? Did I get it right? Or how do you see it, like this thing about meaning?
Yeah, you know, it's fascinating. So I always love this kind of idea. I think Picasso or someone said it, like this idea of like the meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose is to give it away, right? And so this whole idea of like, I feel like there's a lot around COVID. When you think about what COVID did to us, right, as a collective near-death experience, I feel it was, you know, in so many ways really tough, right, and really rough. And I think on the other hand, I think with a lot of people, it also was like, wow, okay, life can be over any minute. So how can I redefine my life towards something that feels more meaningful to me? And so to me, meaning, you know, when you think about the kind of idea that it's something that feels important to us in some way, and that we imbue some kind of, you know, worthiness too, like how do we do that in a moment? To me, really kind of, this was an interesting time where we could step back and say, maybe it isn't what I assumed it is. And I think, you know, like a lot of times in life, right, we might be like, oh yeah, great, the thing that I find meaningful, I do in 10 years after I worked in a bank for 10 years or in consulting, because like then I have enough money to make it happen. Yeah. But once you realize, oh my God, life can be over tomorrow, maybe you shouldn't wait as long. And I think that's your interesting work also, right, to say like, how do you actually get people much earlier to actually realize, hey, look, life can be short, and you got to live, you know, your purpose now versus like in 20 years. And I think everyone defines their purpose differently. But I think to me, it's always kind of this fascinating thing. My purpose had changed over time. Like when I think about, you know, how I connect the dots, what kind of vehicle I use, right? Is it universities, is it a startup or else? Yeah. But what I've always been very conscious about is, in this moment, if I would run in front of a car tomorrow, would I answer the questions differently? That was it worth it? Was life worth it? And today I would answer it differently than when I was back in the day and I had only depressing answers. And I think to me, that's what feels meaningful.
Yeah, gotcha. I mean, it's also a good sense if like you always have to redefine what your purpose is, because this also means you're growing. I mean, my wife and I, we made like our 10-year master plan 3 years ago, and we have to overhaul it. So for starting next year, because you know, there's little bits of progress over the last 3 years, and I'm quite surprised what I have achieved because, you know, knowing myself, I'm like, well, I wouldn't have bet on him. So let's jump into the topic, because, you know, this word serendipity, it's quite hard for us Germans somehow to grasp the full meaning of it, you know. because and I fit this, actually the subtitle, the art and science of creating good luck, helped me to understand, okay. But it seems to me, after listening to your audiobook, like it is much more. Can you give us a definition? What is serendipity, and how come that you research it?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, kudos to your humility. I really appreciated that you said, right, that you wouldn't have expected, like, you might do XYZ things, and then actually you probably had to, like, put yourself into uncertainty and somehow push boundaries and then make it happen, right? And so I think that's actually the sign of great leaders, right? That in a way you then still put yourself into discomfort and go out there and do things. And it is
uncomfortable, yeah.
But that's the fascinating thing, right?
Thank you.
That's a whole conversation in itself, but we should definitely at some point talk more about that. But no, so to your question, what I find fascinating about serendipity is, so usually when we think about luck, we think a lot about it as something passive, right? So it is something that happens to us. And, you know, being born into a good family, stuff like that, things we can't really choose, things we don't work for. It's either work or luck, right? And so people would say, oh, I was just lucky. And so completely discount that a lot of times it took them a lot of effort to be lucky. Serendipity is all about smart luck. It's about kluges Glück. It's about the idea that you work for that kind of luck. And so if you think about, you know, take up to 50% of innovations and inventions, right? Viagra, penicillin, a lot of papers at the moment where breweries turned into hand sanitizer companies because they realized we can't use our alcohol anymore, but we can, you know, use it. We can't use it anymore to sell it to restaurants, but we can use it for hand sanitizer, things like that. That's kind of like seeing something in the unexpected and then creating your own luck based on that. And, you know, my quintessential, you know, example really is, imagine you have hand movements like I do, like very kind of erratic, you know, kind of constantly spilling coffee.
Very typical for a German.
True that. But imagine, you know, you spill coffee over someone in a coffee shop, and, you know, they look at you annoyedly, but you sense there's something there, right? You just sense there's something. You don't know what it is. You just sense it. And now you have two options, right? Option number one is you just say, I'm so sorry. You walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken with that person? Option number two, you speak with the person, that person becomes the love of your life, your co-founder, you name it. The point here is that we will later say, oh my God, it was so lucky. We were at the right place at the right time to run into this person. Yeah, but you worked for it. If it was your love now, you went on different dates, you made that initial conversation, same with other things. And so when you look back on those moments that seem lucky in our life, that were not the kind of blind dumb luck, a lot of times it's the same process of an unexpected moment, but then us connecting the dots and doing something with it. And that's really what serendipity is about, making accidents meaningful, but also what we can talk about, creating more meaningful accidents.
Yeah. I mean, as a sociologist, we are somehow primed to, you know, not really believe in luck because, you know, there are a lot that can be predicted based on your socioeconomic status, and quite early. Like I just wrote my master's thesis about a multidimensional poverty. And it's quite shocking to see, like, if you have experienced poverty in Germany until you were 14, your chances to break out of poverty experiences are quite low. At the same time, my life is sort of totally different. I'm born in Venezuela. I've been brought up the first 8.5 years there. And when we moved to Germany, my father, although he's German, he did not have any sort of formal education here in Germany because he moved out as a hippie. So when we came back, we also had this, you know, poverty experience. But looking at my life right now, I'm like, it's quite good. I'm quite fortunate, but not just fortunate. I mean, for instance, last week in a dinner, I just had the opportunity to talk to the intendant here in Cologne. It was quite interesting just to see how easy it is, or it was, to just start a conversation with him, and now to see how many dots are being combined. So, you know, there's this proactive part. After listening to your book, it switched. It made click. There were some things I did intuitively, but now I got it. Can you stress this a bit? Because I think that it really makes a huge difference. It made a huge difference for me, like on my outlook, you know, like how do I look at life, and also analyzing my past.
Yeah, I love that question because a lot of my work is in extreme resource constrained settings. So, parts of sub-Saharan Africa where people are in extreme poverty. And, I've always been very curious about that question in terms of what is mindset versus what is societal kind of inequality and structure. And I think when we talk about mindset now, like that's the focus, but at the same time, absolutely we have to work on societal inequalities, within countries. I mean, we've seen that, right, when it comes to gender, race, you name it, like how there's so much structural inequality that the base level of potential serendipity is very different, right? Me sitting here in the West Village in New York, I have access to education, to networks, very different starting point than the social entrepreneur in Kinshasa who doesn't have that.
Yeah.
What I'm fascinated by is that in almost any given context, the starting levels might be extremely different, but in almost any context, you find people who have a little bit more serendipity and people who have less serendipity. Mm-hmm. And so what do I mean with this? So there's an amazing organization, for example, in Cape Flats in Cape Town. And, they are people come out of a very rough setting, former drug dealers, like very kind of crime-ridden community. And they essentially said, okay, let's develop a low-cost education methodology, things like 10 steps to use social media to build your business and stuff like that. And then they go into other communities. And instead of focusing on resources that they don't have, they say, what's already here and how do we make the best of it? There's an old garage, fantastic. Let's turn it into a training center. There's a former drug dealer, fantastic. That could be a potential teacher because they're creative. They have a lot of social capital locally. And so when we turn them into a teacher, we can turn a community around because now it's cool to do education because the cool kid is the teacher. And so the fascinating thing is once you reframe a context away from resource constraints, then serendipity becomes more likely. Again, by any means, structural inequality, that's something that it's such a differentiating factor. We have to work on it. But when we think about, now a lot of people are lamenting about, budget cuts, this and this. Yeah, you know what? If someone in the Cape Flats of Cape Town can do it, you can do it, right? Yeah, and so the point is that it's really, to me, a lot around exactly that question that there's the things we can't influence. To your point, that's the sociological, structural constraints, and they are objectively there, and we have to work on them. And we can also never blame anyone for bad luck, right? That happens to anyone. But then at the same time, within any context, and we've studied contexts around the world, there's always people who have a little bit more serendipity than others. And so that's what I'm fascinated by. And that's really, to give you one simple example, right? And I think to your point, maybe I'll use an example that's about connecting dots because I really like, to your point, right? That's what you intuitively do once you get into that mindset. And one of my favorite approaches is the hook strategy. And so the hook strategy is about saying, how do I seed a couple of dots? How do I cast a couple of hooks out there so that other people can connect the dots for me? So what do I mean with this? Take Ollie Barrett, who's an amazing entrepreneur in London. If you would ask Ollie, what do you do? He wouldn't just say, the dreaded question we get at every conference or wherever we go, right? Yeah. He wouldn't just say, I'm a technology entrepreneur. He would say something like, I'm a technology entrepreneur, recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. I recently started hosting piano matinees. You should stop by. Oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister is teaching on the philosophy of science. You should give a guest lecture. The point here is we can use every interaction, every conversation, being it with the intendant in Cologne to the XYZ person we randomly run into, to see the couple of informational interests that we have and just see what do they pick up. Sometimes they might not pick up anything, but from the most unexpected of sources, someone might say, oh my God, such a coincidence. My friend is running a purpose accelerator. Manan, this is exactly what we needed. I'll put you in touch, right? And so it's really about us putting dots out there so that they can happen.
I mean, this encourages me a lot because, my mother always blamed me. You always are out there. You always tell people how you feel, what you do, what you dream of. And especially this vision part, you always stress it's not beneficial for you. And I mean, indeed, it was sometimes in that sense harmful because people can use it like, after years, the dreamer again. But for me, it feels like cultivating this serendipity mindset is like creating my own luck incubator. So, I have to start working the ground. You know, I have to be out there to expose myself to the sweat and the sun and everything, you know, and then starting throwing seeds like, I like this, I like that, you know, I'm into this, I'm not into that, I'm against this, I'm for that. And it takes a while. It takes a while, but man, I have now like another problem. I need to focus because I'm getting so much positive feedback right now that it's really hard for me, like just to stick to my intentional purpose, although, you know, we're always free to change it or iterate it. Christian, when you think about your research, what was the most somehow counterintuitive thing that you discovered? Because I like how you stress that serendipity, or the serendipity mindset and its cultivation somehow levels the field. It's a huge leverage that we have, but what was the most counterintuitive thing that you found out that you didn't expect?
Probably that the most successful people embrace the unexpected in really smart ways. Like when you look at, so we did a study, for example, with over 40 of the world's leading CEOs, you know, companies like MasterCard and others. We sat down and said, what is it that really makes you successful? And what's fascinating is how many of them would have, to your point, a broader sense of direction, right? So like some kind of purpose for themselves and for their organization that kind of gives them a sense of direction. It doesn't always have to be like an exact purpose, right? Sometimes it's just like key values or some kind of sense of direction, right? And then essentially they keep an openness to the unexpected, and they are perfectly fine with adjusting their strategy and their timelines towards that kind of bigger purpose if it makes more sense. So it's in a way exactly what you mentioned about yourself earlier, right? That you're saying, I put something there and I have an approximate timeline and strategy, but I'm adjusting that based on new information, new learning, and so on. And, you know, I found that fascinating when COVID happened, right? So when you look at the states in the US, like some governors use the old school leadership approach. The old school leadership approach is to say, we close the state down now, and here's an exact timeline of exactly when we open it up again. And so I portray complete control here. And that's how we grew up, right, in Germany. Like, be planning, be in control at any given time, and then life happens, and you're like, oh my God. But so essentially, they wanted to portray complete control. Now, of course, they have an incentive whenever new information comes in to hide that information, right? Or to adjust the timeline and look weak as a leader. Now, the new type leadership approach that these CEOs and others are embracing is to say, well, we have two principles, public health and financial health. We have an approximate timeline here, but we're already telling you now that we will like adjust the timeline as soon as new information comes in. Now, when you're adjusting the timeline, it actually looks like a strong move, because you're saying, I told you from the beginning I would do it, and now I'm doing it, and now you can trust me even more. And so I think to me that was surprising, that it's such an active part of strategy for those people to say, I'm not setting myself up for failure here by pretending I know everything. I'm giving you clarity, but I can't always give you certainty. And I think that's kind of like the thing as a leader that you're trying to do, like giving clarity, but not always absolute certainty.
So somehow sticking like more to a meta level, you know, like more like sort of a almost philosophical foundation, as you said, like principles, key values, and then any step you take according to those principles is sort of progress, is perceived as progress, because it actually is, because, you know, we don't want to be stuck in something just because I made the plan 3 years ago. You know, it's Alex Edmonds made me aware of this in his book, Errors of Omission and Commission, and what the difference is between both. Like on the it sounds like not being flexible enough to adapt to circumstances, to new data, or to changing environments is an era of omission, just sticking to the old thing just because we know how to do it. Quite interesting. Let's jump a bit into, now that maybe if I understood it right, is serendipity mindset, its cultivation is on the one hand being open, being out there, going out, somehow taking a leap of faith, be courageous, and then start to connect the dots, also based on the feedback that you get. Like a good advice my father gave me is, go through the door that opens and don't stick to the door that just won't open. So just go through the open doors. It's like, okay, once I see a connection, I go after that. Now we're talking to entrepreneurs, and you're an entrepreneur yourself, and you know a lot of entrepreneurs. How can we as startup builders, entrepreneurs, integrate this? Because I get it on the personal level, you know, and you hinted at it, like also from a political perspective, but how can I, as an entrepreneur who has also responsibility to his stakeholders and shareholders, cultivate serendipity mindset?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I think it comes a lot to how do we make the unexpected our friend rather than seeing it as someone who's kind of, you know, threatening us and our plans and our strategies. And so I'm a big fan of very simple things that we can just integrate into our day-to-day. We don't have to change a lot of, you know, change is hard, and we don't have to directly charge, like even as entrepreneurs, right? We always think we're so like out there and innovative. No, I mean, ambiguity always sucks, right? So so I'm a big fan, for example, of simple things like, what surprised you last week in a weekly meeting? Just asking, what surprised you last week? What comes up a lot of times then is that people start questioning assumptions and seeing that as a natural part. To give you an example, there's this you know, a company in China I've been working with. They produce washing machines, and so they received calls from farmers, and the farmers told them, your crappy washing machine is always breaking down. Well, why is the washing machine breaking down? Well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in them, but it doesn't seem to work. So now, look, if you're an entrepreneur who says, I produce this washing machine so that it washes potatoes, that's in my marketing plan, so I will continue to sell washing machines for clothes. Then you will tell the farmer, let me educate you to not wash your potatoes in that, because that's not part of the plan. Now, when you ask people in the weekly meeting what surprised you, and you make it part of your plan that actually you want to have innovation happen all the time, they might say, we were really surprised that they washed the potatoes in it. Why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? And that's actually how, in this case, unexpectedly, serendipitously, the potato washing machine became one of their products. The key point here is we all talk about constantly improving, innovation, and so on, but a lot of us actually are very focused on executing on a particular product versus, to your point, stepping back and saying, let's execute on our bigger vision and what we want to do. That might be through a washing machine for clothes, but maybe it's also a washing machine for potatoes. And maybe we have to iterate quickly, because if we wait too long, it becomes more costly. And so it's really, especially as entrepreneurs, you know, we talk a lot about design thinking, this and this and this, but you know what, like you can't just do this in one workshop. Like you have to continuously build it into your practices. And so I think it's simple things like this, you know, constantly questioning your assumptions by simple questions like what surprised you last week and things like that, that incentivize people to legitimize the unexpected as a part of strategy.
In system theory, we say like all systems have communication, and it's always a binary. Either you have it or have it not. In politics is, you know, you have the vote, you don't have the vote. And for us, companies is like revenue or no revenue. And what you're saying is being open to stuff that we might perceive as nuisance, like as noise, like why should I care about farmers? I'm building a washing machine for clothes, so you know, get the hell out of here. So, but you say no. Be open to this noise, to your system, and somehow reevaluate your hypothesis of what you are doing, and see if there is maybe a connection, maybe there is a door that you have not been considering enough. Because I mean, this is a huge potential that now opens up, you know, not just washing machines for clothes, but now for potatoes. And I think, I don't know how it is in rural China, but I guess there is a lot of potential for a company there.
Well, man, on exactly that point, right? Where it gets really interesting then, I think, in the day-to-day business, right? Let's say, take the simple example, it comes to exactly what you just mentioned. How big do we allow the opportunity space to be of potential dots that we allow ourselves and others to connect for potential new ideas, potential new products, and everything else? And so it's even simple things in our language that we might not realize, right? So if, for example, let's say I faced bankruptcy in my life, right? I'm sure quite a few people in the room might have as well, or financial crunch time, right? So imagine you're in a financial crunch time, right? And now if you're telling your employees, we have to reduce costs. Now, what they will do is they will try to like reduce costs, right? So they will run around and say, oh, can we save here? Can we save here? Can we save here? If you would have instead said, come up with ways that help us like financially in some way, they might also come up with saying, no, let's change the product and charge more for the product because actually, you know, the price point is wrong and we could charge this. So you can also think about revenues. And so my point is, if you quickly focus on defining a too narrow problem, then you're limiting the opportunity space. Versus if you step back and say, I want to give you a focus, so I will tell you we have to survive here, but I want you to not only think about costs, I want you to think bigger about what else you could do. And so I think it's really about what you mentioned, that opportunity space and allowing people to work around that.
Besides the language I use as a leader, what else can I do structurally, like to, you know, make my company, my team all participate in this, you know, because it is crucial. I have been working as a freelancer doing business development for the last years for people. And what I love the most is going into an existing business and see what assets are produced that are sort of garbage, considered garbage or noise, nuisance that you have to deal with, and recombining them and putting a new product out there, you know, because that's what I like. But I get it that most people don't like it. And especially if you are an employee in a sort of bigger company, you're actually trained not to think that much ahead and outside your set boundaries. So besides language, Christian, what can I do to actually, you know, leverage this potential of serendipity mindset in my organization?
Yeah, well, I'd say there's two major things. One is practices, and the other one is culture. And I'll give you one example of each. So in terms of culture, what I always do whenever I work with an organization is I do the water cooler test. So I sit somewhere in the organization where people convene, right? Like being at the water cooler, being at the canteen or whatever. And I just listen to what people talk about. And what people talk about tell you a lot about, right? So in some companies, people might say something like, oh, you know, Anna, she again messed this thing up. How could she do this? So it's essentially gossiping. It's essentially talking about other people and talking trash about people. That's a really negative corporate culture, right? Versus in others, you might have more the kind of like, hey, I just came out of this meeting and I had this idea now, and then we could do this. And so it's more ideas focused. And so it's really kind of like, you know, depending on where we are on that kind of corporate culture, like healthiness, there's different like practices we can do to make the corporate culture better. But let's assume for now we have an okay corporate culture. Then one of my favorite practices actually is the project funeral. And the project funeral is about saying, usually in an organization or in any kind of social setting, we have an incentive to not talk about the things that didn't work, because we don't want to look like the loser, the failure, the person who messed something up. And so unfortunately, we don't really learn from each other, because the most interesting things come from the things that didn't work. And then the key thing of the project funeral is to reframe it. The failure is not a failure now, but it's experimentation. And so it's about the idea of saying, when a project idea or so didn't work, the person who's responsible for it lays it to rest, like puts it into begräbnis in front of people from other divisions or other team members, and then reflects on what did we learn from this. So it's not about celebrating the failure, it's about celebrating the learning from what didn't work. What's fascinating is in those moments, constantly dots get connected. So in this one, for example, there's a company that produced like window glass, and the idea was, you know, the light wouldn't reflect. Amazing technology, but they realized, oh wow, the market is not big enough, so they laid it to rest in front of people from other divisions. Now someone in the audience goes like, hey, have you considered what this would mean for solar? Have you considered, if we put this into a solar context, how much energy that might absorb? And that's how coincidentally part of their solar division emerged, right? Nobody saw it coming. It was the right person at the right time, yada yada. No, but the point is, you created a practice that made it more likely that people can connect the dots for each other, but also they allow the kind of controlled vulnerability, right? So this idea that you make people connect with each other on a deeper level, because it's not about oversharing. It's not about like, oh my God, let me like give you everything I have in terms of my emotions, but you're saying in a controlled setting, you let people share a little bit of vulnerability so that other people want to help them in some way. And then we realize an idea might not be bad at all. It might just be bad in the context, right? And so it's kind of, and so that's really one of the things I enjoy the most. So thinking about those kind of practices that help us, that really we can just build into it. If we are in more competitive culture, and I think that comes to your work, right? In competitive cultures, I'm always thinking a lot about suits. You know, this
Yeah, yeah,
This Netflix
the
series.
series. Yeah, yeah.
I'm always so fascinated, right? When Harvey and what's the Lewis, who are the two high-powered lawyers, right? They are always fighting to the nails until they have a purpose of saving their protege, right? When it's about Mike at some point, and at that point in the series, when they both like him and want to protect him, then now they have a purpose to work on together. And then they're the most amazing collaborators for a very short period of time. And then again, they go into their thing. But my point is like creating that glue that allows us to want to connect the dots because we have something we want to do together. To me, that's why this whole conversation on purpose and values is so important, because it's the glue between wanting to connect the dots versus not connecting them.
What I like about your example with non-reflecting glass, was it, and like putting it in a different context, is I think this is what we often as the audience or the markets perceive as the obvious innovation. Like, yeah, of course it would work. Of course, you know, like things that seem obvious, but we don't give them enough room. I know it from my own life and circumstances. Like sometimes all I need is just a context switch. Sometimes I feel just very incompetent as a sociologist, which I might be, but you know, then I go with my bit of sociological knowledge into the startup field, and I'm like, oh wow, okay, yeah, I can contribute. You know, on the one hand, it's good for me and my ego, but on the other hand, it also benefits hopefully the community, because for me it's quite obvious. For me, you know, all things I do are easy, obvious, natural, whatever. But and maybe this also brings us back to the courage part. We often are just too comfortable and not courageous enough to have a context switch. It's always costly, it's always somehow painful, but in the end it always seems to work. So as a leader, culture and practices, looking at the broader context now, like as you said, we have like this natural experiment with COVID. What are your experiences? Are we able to leverage the potential of serendipity in a broader context? Because I'm looking at the world, and I'm in the past I said I was a hopeless optimistic. Now I say I'm a hopeful optimistic. How do you see it? How do you perceive the world? How has it changed? And which role can serendipity mindset play in it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll answer it in a second. First, what you just said about the hopeful optimist, it reminds me a little of Viktor Frankl, when he took flying lessons, and he talks about how the flight instructor always told him, well, Victor, if you want to fly like this, you have to start like this because the wind will pull you down. So if you start as a realist, you end up as a depressionist. But if you start as an optimist, you end up as the real realist. And I've seen that a lot in my life too, right? That in a way, you need that kind of additional little bit of optimism to see the potentiality, right? To see what could be. Because again, right, the world can be a very depressing place. But actually, once you see a potential teacher in a drug dealer, right? Because you feel there's more there than meets the eye, then actually you socially construct almost a new reality, or a part of socially constructing that. And I think that's the fascinating thing about entrepreneurship, right? But I think to your question, what I found fascinating during COVID is, again, the framing question, right? So I personally had really rough COVID experiences, right? In terms of near death and things like that. But also, you know, so I had my book come out right when COVID happened. So our review copies got stuck in the office, couldn't get sent out. As a first-time author, you know, it was supposed to be in all the airport stores and everywhere. Everything was closed down. So like there was no physical touch points anymore. And so I was like, oh my God. But then, you know, hey, it went much more global, because now you could speak at a conference in Kinshasa in the morning, and then you could be in Tokyo, and you could, without having to actually go through customs and like take 2 days to be there. And so in a way, I found it fascinating when you reframe towards, okay, Zoom is now my own private plane. I can be in your living room right now. And of course, I miss the energy. I miss the kind of other things that come from it. But what I've seen with organizations is that I think there were those companies that were really smart about it and said, okay, what are the elements of the physical world that we're missing now that we can recreate, and what are additional things we can do? And so, for example, one of the key things that of course has been missing are these water cooler moments, right? Where you just bump into someone in front of the water cooler or in the canteen that tell you about a new idea, you connect the dots, and then there's a new project or a promotion or you name it, right? So that's been taken away now that we don't bump into each other as much. So what some companies have been doing is random coffee trials, where they essentially say, okay, people within an organization, give us a couple of times when they're free. They get randomly matched across hierarchies, across different divisions, and then they grab a quick coffee with an inspiring prompt, right? So what's the challenge you're facing at the moment in the organization, whatever it is, and then they get randomly matched. And it's amazing to see not only the kind of serendipity that helps, that emerges, but also how it recreates that sense of belonging with the company, because we're always talking with the same 4 or 5 people, right? If we're in a larger company, it's always the same people we talk with. So there's no sense of belonging towards the company, just like towards the team. And so that really recreates that sense of belonging as well. So I'm a big fan of thinking about what are the physical strategies and things that we are, or physical things that we can somehow replicate online and then do that. And I think COVID has forced us in a way into more necessity-based serendipity, right? In terms of like,
definitely,
what are things we have to pivot towards to make things happen.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing is also when we are stricken by bad luck, catastrophes, unexpected circumstances, it's always also a good time, as you now several times have pointed out, to ask why. You know, the somehow, from my point of view, the most neglected question in the world: why? Of whatever. Why am I here? Why am I having this conversation with you? Why am I doing what I'm doing? Because in the end, I find it like people struggle a lot answering that question because they feel they have to find the ultimate answer. But what I find quite encouraging about your book is that it says, no, you don't have to. You just have to be open-minded and keeping cultivating it, because you will come a step closer. Like you said in the beginning, you were 18 when you had the accident, and now you had a second near-death experience with COVID. And you just take the chance, this opportunity to reframe things. And it hints at our potential for growth. And this is what makes me like hopeful, because we can grow. We don't have to be perfect, but let's make progress somehow. And talking about it, what would you consider now, having those two experiences, maybe not the purpose for your life or in your life, but maybe it's, let's say, for the next period or episode of the Christian Busch saga?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very focused on, so everything that I believe in, everything that I've seen work, everything that like I've seen in science is in the book. And so essentially, to me, the next years is about how do I take that content into as many curricula, into as many universities, into as many organizations as I can, because I've seen it to be such an effective way to live a more purposeful, meaningful, successful life. But also, you know, I mean, what I found fascinating is, you know, over the last kind of year now that the book's been out, I've had parents reach out, say, hey, look, like this is a way for me to connect with my autistic kid more meaningfully. Or psychologists saying, hey, this is a way for me to have a toolkit to decrease anxiety in my patients. And so it's all these unexpected areas of application where I thought it's more focused on like the business crowd and maybe kind of people who want to self-improve their life. But actually, it's a lot about people helping other people, especially their kids or their patients. And so I found it fascinating to think about how can we, the next years, like see this as a platform that can be taken into so many different directions and connect the dots in that way that it really kind of helps hopefully improve a lot of people's lives. And, you know, by the way, one thing, just as to your previous comment, also what I found really fascinating, what you mentioned around, right, that people sometimes assume that you have to have this big purpose, big meaning, and like spend theoretical time on it, versus I'm really also a big fan of just kind of, in a way, rubber stamping forward, of saying, okay, sometimes in my life, I might not know, but what I can do is I can put myself into places that can help me figure it out. And so I'm a big fan of this kind of portfolio approach where you say, okay, if I'm working on something at the moment, being that entrepreneurial idea, if I work in a consultancy, whatever it is, how do I spend 5% of my time trying a couple of things that I feel might be meaningful, but I can't take any risk. And so I place like low risk bets, right?
Yeah.
So like when you go traveling, right? When you go traveling, you have this open mind where you just explore new things. So if you do that same thing in your own life with other things within where you are, right? Join this one other community and like go to a couple of gatherings, get a feeling for what's out there. That's actually where the next cool thing will come from, because you will not theoretically know what's out there. Because if you go on Google and say, I'm searching for what is purposeful for someone who's in the medical industry at the moment, like you will get like medical industry purposeful results. Yeah. But like someone might, you at an event you run into might tell you, hey, you know what, like unexpectedly so, your skill set actually really applies to a completely different industry where you could be completely different, but still achieve the same thing you want to do. And to me, that's the fascinating thing, that a lot of times we cannot know our purpose. We have to co-create it with others. And on that journey, I think, and that's what I love about, I think, you know, your focus on community and like that, like community is the only way to really figure it out. Like the only way to really figure things out is to help other people help us connect the dots.
Yeah, I have to thank you and Anthony L. Burrow from Cornell, because, you know, I also believe that you have to find purpose, you know, but then this cultivation of a mindset of purpose and serendipity totally changes everything. Like it makes me more relaxed. It makes me far more productive because it's like you said, it's just placing small bets, but constantly. I want to be respectful with your time. So maybe the last question, because this is something I have been struggling with. And I've got a bet. And my bet is that I believe that in the future, or the new generations of really successful entrepreneurs that achieve something meaningful are Renaissance men and women, like generalists. You know, in the past, we have been told you have to be specialist. And listening to you, I somehow find it confirmed, but maybe I'm not listening well, because what somehow the Renaissance man for me is someone who has a lot of interest and has this difficulty, like to keep, you know, them all balanced. But he's got his potential for a lot of good. As people say, innovation always happens at the edges of, you know, the silos, the networks, the industries. So would you agree or disagree with me? Hopefully you disagree and we can quarrel a bit.
Well, I would say it depends. And it's like the Ronald Dragon. I always love this idea when Ronald Dragon, the US president back in the days, he would sometimes say, I want to cut one hand of the economist, because he would ask his economic advisor, what should I do now? And then the economic advisor would say, well, on one hand, on the other hand. And so, no, I just want one hand. I want one easy solution here. But so my point is, I'll say the two-hand answer, which is really, to me, this comes a lot back to the question of what is it that we want to do in our life? You know, you can live a perfectly meaningful life by building deep expertise in a field. Let's say you're a chemist, you build extremely deep expertise, and then you can raise the ladder by focusing deeply on this. And then if you have a bit of serendipity, maybe you rise a little bit more in the ranks, but like you can really focus on that kind of area. Versus, you know, a lot of entrepreneurs and others might be kind of more generalist, and then kind of go around and then find a co-founder who's like the deep skilled person, whatever it is. My point is, I want to use the metaphor of what happens with students. So I do a lot of thesis supervision. So I have a lot of students come in who say, I want to write my master thesis about XYZ topic. And a lot of times you can very quickly say within a conversation, if someone will be like an absolute rock star with their thesis, like original, creative, amazing, or if they will be solid and great, but not that kind of additional, like amazing. And so the way it is the good person comes in and says, I know exactly what I want to write about. I know exactly where I can find it. This is exactly what I want to do. Can you give me your stamp of approval? I'm like, great, run with it. They will be solid. Now, and that to me is kind of like okay, there's one thing I'm interested in, and I will do that, one literature, and that's it. Yeah. Now the distinction person comes in and says, oh, you know, I read into this and this and this, and I found this really interesting, and this also relates to this, and but now like I'm not really sure where to go. And that ambiguity, that friction, that kind of like creative tension creates that spark of originality that then lets them go either really far, or if they lose track, like go the other way, right? And so to me, that's kind of like, it's almost like the kind of, it's not higher risk strategy, but it's the kind of strategy that, you know, if you're like the Steve Jobs type person, you will create more better, but it could also have happened the other way around, where you could have not done anything really interesting. And so my point is, I think like this kind of whole idea of Renaissance man, woman is great, because I think in a world that has such complex challenges, it's what we need, right? Like complex challenges needs people who connect the dots between different areas. So ideally they have exposure in those different areas, or if not, they cope up with those, right? So ideally you have co-founding teams that are diverse enough to really be able to connect dots between those different areas. So long story short, I believe you can do that in yourself, like being that Renaissance person, or you can build a team that almost represents a Renaissance person, but like,
interesting.
Several people.
Interesting. Yeah, that, I think that would be even the best approach to somehow be a Renaissance culture.
Oh, I love the term, man. That's a good one.
Yeah. I love it too. And I'm just put it in my mouth. Wow. Yeah, this has been very insightful. I mean, I know your stuff, but I'm so glad to have you here, and I learned a lot again. Listening to you, although I have been listening to you via your audiobook, and I think almost all podcast appearances that you have had in the last year. So thank you again. It's been a pleasure. I think the community will definitely appreciate your work, and hopefully we can somehow contribute to a better world with more purpose and serendipity mindset. So thank you again.
Well, thank you so much, man. And I really appreciate your thoughtful questions, and you really kind of, connecting the dots between all those different areas. So yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, let's do it again.
Would love to. Thanks so much. Have a good one. Thank you.